She asked the Amish man for a job, and he said, "Only if you'll marry me by sunset." In a dusty frontier town, a desperate widow knocks on a barn door, hoping for honest work. But what she gets instead is a proposal that will change both their lives forever. The church bell tolls, gossiping voices whisper, and by nightfall she's a wife to a man she barely knows. At first, it seems like a roof over her head, maybe even a second chance. But then, the truth comes out. The land he owns is under siege. The railroad wants it, the sheriff is in their pocket, and saboteurs are willing to burn it all down. Now, her vow means more than survival. It means standing beside a man scorned by the town, guarding land meant for their future, and uncovering secrets that could break them or bind them forever. Can a marriage made in desperation become a covenant of love strong enough to defy greed, fire, and betrayal? Or will sunset bring the end of everything they dared to hope for? Tell me in the comments where you're watching from right now, and if this story speaks to you. Make sure you hit subscribe so you don't miss the next one. Mara's heart thundered in her chest as she stared at Josiah Stoltzfus, certain she had misheard his words. The late afternoon breeze stirred her skirts, carrying the scent of hay and horses from the nearby livery stable. She gripped her carpet bag tighter, her knuckles white against the worn leather. "I beg your pardon?" she managed to whisper. Josiah straightened from his work on the barn hinge, his tall frame casting a long shadow across the dusty ground. His plain black hat and simple clothes marked him clearly as Amish, setting him apart from the other townspeople, who had been watching her with such judgment in their eyes. "I need a wife," he said simply, his voice steady and measured. "And you need a home. It seems God has brought us together at the right moment." Mara swallowed hard, studying his face. His features were weathered but kind, his beard neatly trimmed in the Amish way. There was no mockery in his eyes, only a careful assessment that matched her own. "But sir," she protested, "you don't know anything about me." "I know you're honest," he replied, gesturing to her plain dress and the simple gold band still on her finger. "You told me straight away you're a widow. And I can see you're willing to work." He paused, looking at her carpet bag. "That's all you brought with you?" Mara nodded, fighting back tears of exhaustion and uncertainty. Everything else was sold. "To pay the doctors." The words caught in her throat, memories of Thomas's long illness still raw and painful. Josiah's expression softened slightly. "I lost someone too," he said quietly. "My betrothed Sarah 3 years ago." He turned back to the barn door, testing the repaired hinge. "I have a good farm, Mistress Whitfield. 200 acres, debt-free, but I need help to keep it running." The church bell rang again, its deep tone echoing through the settling dust. Mara counted 5 chimes, just 1 hour until sunset. Her legs trembled beneath her skirts as the full weight of the decision pressed upon her. "Why so quick?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. "Why today?" Josiah met her gaze directly. "Because winter's coming, and there's much work to be done before the first snow. Because you need shelter tonight, and I won't have people gossiping about an unmarried woman staying at my farm." He picked up his tools, movements precise and methodical. "And because I've prayed for guidance, and here you are." Mara looked down the street toward the center of town. The dressmaker's door was firmly closed, the boarding house windows reflecting the orange glow of sunset. She had exactly $12.43 in her reticule, not enough to last a week, even if someone would rent to her. Would this be, she hesitated, choosing her words carefully, a marriage in name only? "It would be a proper marriage," Josiah answered firmly. "I believe in doing things right before God and man. But," he added, seeing the flash of fear in her eyes, "I also believe in kindness and patience. We would learn to know each other, in time." A wagon clattered past, the driver tipping his hat to Josiah while barely glancing at Mara. She watched. It disappeared down the street, leaving fresh swirls of dust in its wake. The sun sank lower, painting the clouds in shades of pink and gold. "I can cook," she said suddenly. "And so, I've managed a household before, and I'm not afraid of hard work." Josiah nodded. "Those are good skills for a farmer's wife." He hesitated, then added more gently, "I know this isn't what you dreamed of, Mistress Whitfield, but I'll treat you with respect, and you'll have a roof over your head and food on the table. The land is good, and with God's blessing, we can make a life there." Mara closed her eyes briefly, offering up a silent prayer for guidance. When she opened them, the street had grown darker, and Josiah was waiting patiently for her answer. She thought of Thomas, of their early days of love and laughter, now buried with him in that small cemetery back east. She thought of the long months of grief that followed, of selling their belongings one by one to pay his medical bills, of the pitying looks from former friends who offered no real help. Here was a man offering her, not romance, but something perhaps more valuable: dignity, purpose, and a chance to build something new. Her voice was steady when she finally spoke. "Yes," she said, "I'll marry you, Mr. Stoltzfus." The relief in Josiah's eyes was brief but visible. He picked up his toolbox and gestured toward the whitewashed church at the end of the street. The Reverend Miller should still be in his study. "We'll need 2 witnesses." He paused, looking at her with quiet certainty. "Are you sure about this?" The heavy barn door creaked as Josiah led Mara inside, away from prying eyes. Dust motes danced in the slanting sunlight that filtered through the weathered boards. The familiar sense of hay and leather filled the cool shadows. "There's something more you need to know," Josiah said, his voice low and earnest. He removed his black hat, holding it between calloused hands. "My father passed last spring. His will had conditions." Mara's heart quickened. "What sort of conditions?" "I must be married by sunset today, or the farm goes to my cousins in Pennsylvania." Josiah's fingers tightened on his hat brim. "They've been waiting for this day, hoping I'd fail. They want to sell the land to the railroad." Understanding dawned in Mara's mind. "That's why you proposed so suddenly." "Yes." Josiah met her gaze directly. "I won't deceive you about that. But I meant what I said about it being a proper marriage." He spoke of his Amish faith then, of the plain life and hard work it demanded. His words were measured, careful, like a man who knew the weight of every promise. Mara listened, then shared her own story in turn. "Thomas, my husband, he worked for the railroad," she said softly. "There was an accident with a coupling. The company never paid what they promised. I sold everything to pay the doctors, but it wasn't enough to save him." The shadows in the barn grew longer as they talked. Through a gap in the boards, Mara could see the sun sinking toward the western hills. Time was running out. "Some might say I'm mad," Josiah said finally, "or that I'm testing you cruelly. But I assure you, I am neither." Mara studied his face. In the dim light, there was no madness there, only steady conviction and something that might have been hope. "I believe you," she said simply. They walked together down the dusty street toward the white-painted church. Word of their intentions had somehow spread already. Townspeople gathered in doorways and on porches, whispering behind raised hands. "Shameful." "Business," one woman muttered loudly enough to be heard. "That Amish fellow's desperate, I reckon," another replied. Mara held her head high, though her cheeks burned. Josiah walked beside her, silent but protective, his presence steady as a wall. Against the gossip, the church stood small but dignified against the darkening sky. Inside, Pastor William Abernathy looked up from his desk, surprise evident on his gentle face. "Brother Stoltzfus? Mistress Whitfield?" He set down his pen. "What brings you here at this hour?" Josiah explained their situation plainly, the terms of his father's will, the looming deadline, their mutual need for partnership. The pastor listened with growing concern, his fingers worrying at his collar. "This is unusual," he said carefully. "Are you both certain about this course?" "We are," Josiah replied firmly. Mara nodded, though her heart fluttered like a trapped bird. Through the church windows, faces pressed against the glass. More townsfolk had gathered, drawn by the prospect of scandal. Their whispers carried through. The thin walls. A bargain wedding, that's what it is. No better than a business deal. Ain't proper, if you ask me. Pastor Abernathy hesitated, then squared his shoulders. Very well, we'll need witnesses. 2 church deacons were summoned, their expressions carefully neutral as they took their places. The ceremony itself was brief but solemn. Mara's hands trembled as she signed the church ledger. Her new name, Mara Stoltzfus, looking strange and foreign in her careful script. When the pastor pronounced them husband and wife, Mara felt a curious mixture of emotions wash over her. Relief at having secured shelter and safety, warred with terror at the magnitude of what she'd done. The gold ring on her finger seemed to grow heavier with each passing moment. The sun had nearly set as they stepped out of the church. The street had filled with onlookers, their faces showing everything from curiosity to outright scorn. Married an outsider, has he? Wonder how long this'll last. Ain't natural, rushing like that. The jeers followed them down the street like stray dogs, nipping at their heels. Josiah walked tall, his face impassive, but Mara saw how his jaw tightened at each barbed comment. She wanted to run, to hide from the mocking faces and wagging tongues. Instead, she forced herself to match Josiah's steady pace, drawing strength from his quiet dignity. They were married now for better or worse, and she would not begin this new life by showing shame or fear. The last rays of sunlight painted the western sky in deep gold and purple as husband and wife made their way through the gauntlet of gossip. Whatever tomorrow might bring, they had met the terms of the will. The farm was safe. But as darkness settled over the town, Mara wondered what price they would both pay for this hasty bargain, sealed in the shadows of sunset. The evening breeze carried the scent of sage as Josiah and Mara walked the dusty path to his homestead. Her carpet bag felt heavier with each step, weighted perhaps by the enormity of what she'd done. The setting sun cast long shadows across the prairie grass, and crickets began their evening chorus. Josiah's farmhouse emerged from the twilight, a modest structure of weathered wood and careful craftsmanship. He held the door for her, then lit a brass lamp that cast a warm glow throughout the main room. Mara stood just inside, taking in her new home. Everything had its place. Hand-planed shelves lined one wall, holding neatly stacked dishes and cooking implements. The furniture was plain but well made, a solid table with 4 chairs, a rocking chair near the hearth, a bench beneath the window. The floor had been recently swept, and curtains hung straight at the windows. It spoke of order, of patient care. "I'll prepare us something to eat," Josiah said, moving to the kitchen area. His actions were efficient as he stoked the cook stove and gathered supplies. Soon, the aroma of warming beans filled the room. They sat across from each other at the table, the lamp between them casting shifting shadows on their faces. A plate of dark bread and a bowl of beans sat before each of them. The silence stretched thick as molasses. Josiah bowed his head. "Lord, we thank thee for this food and ask thy blessing upon it. Guide us in thy ways. Amen." "Amen," Mara echoed softly. They ate without speaking for several minutes. The clink of spoons against bowls seemed unnaturally loud. Finally, Josiah cleared his throat. "There are duties that need tending here," he said. "The chickens need feeding morning and evening. There's mending to be done, meals to prepare." He paused. "And during planting and harvest, every hand is needed in the fields." Mara set down her spoon carefully. "I can cook well enough, and my needle is quick and sure. But I've never worked a farm before." She lifted her chin. "I'm willing to learn." Josiah nodded, seeming satisfied with her honesty. "That's all I ask." After the dishes were washed and dried, Josiah showed her to a small room off the main living area. A narrow bed with a quilted cover stood against one wall, a chest of drawers against another. A single window looked out onto the darkened prairie. "Sleep." "Well," Josiah said simply, then left her alone. Mara sat on the edge of the bed, still fully dressed. Outside, coyotes began their nightly chorus, wild, lonely sounds that made her shiver despite the mild night. Her mind whirled like autumn leaves in a storm. What had she done, binding herself to the stranger? How could she possibly fulfill the role of farmer's wife? Would she ever feel at home in this alien place? Sleep came in fitful patches, and she woke before dawn. The first gray light was just touching the horizon as she made her way to the pump in the yard. The handle creaked as she worked it, and the water came cold and clear into her bucket. The morning air held a chill that promised autumn wasn't far off. As Mara carried the heavy bucket back to the house, she realized with sudden clarity, this was her life now. This pump, this yard, this house belonged to her as much as to Josiah. The thought was both comforting and terrifying. Inside, she started the cook stove and put coffee on to boil. Josiah came in from the barn smelling of hay and honest work. They shared a breakfast of porridge and the remaining bread from the night before. As they ate, Josiah's expression grew serious. "There's something else you should know," he said. "The railroad's been pressing hard for this land. They want to build a depot here." Mara's spoon stopped halfway to her mouth. "Is that why your cousins want to sell?" "Yes, the railroad agent, Thomas Keene, has been making offers. Good money, he says." Josiah's jaw tightened. "But this land was my father's dream. He worked it honest and true. I won't see it torn up for trains and trading posts." "And now that we're married," Mara began. "Now you're part of this too," Josiah finished. "I'm sorry for that burden, but you should know what's coming." Mara thought of her Thomas, broken by those same railroad men, of promises unkept and compensation denied. She straightened her shoulders. "Then we'll face it together." The week settled into a steady rhythm, each dawn bringing new lessons in farm life. Mara rose with the sun, her Methodist upbringing having taught her the value of diligence. The chicken coop became her first morning stop, where speckled hens pecked at her skirts as she gathered warm eggs in her apron. The washing line stretched between two posts, and Monday found her wrestling with heavy wet sheets that snapped in the prairie. Whined. Her hands, once skilled only with delicate needlework, grew rough from scrubbing clothes against the washboard. Yet she took pride in seeing clean garments dancing in the breeze, a visible sign of her contribution to their shared life. In the evenings, she sat by lamplight, mending Josiah's torn work shirts. Her stitches were tiny and even, each one a testament to her training as a seamstress. Sometimes she caught Josiah watching her work, though he quickly looked away when their eyes met. Josiah himself remained as steady as the land he worked. His words were few but carefully chosen, especially when teaching her the ways of the farm. "Like this," he would say, demonstrating how to properly lift a harness onto their old mule's back. His hands, strong from years of labor, moved with surprising gentleness as he showed her how to check the straps and buckles. "The mule must trust you," he explained one morning, his voice soft and patient. "She can sense fear or anger." His steady manner never wavered, even when Mara fumbled with knots or dropped tools. Not once did he raise his voice or show frustration. At her mistakes, wood carrying proved challenging for Mara's citified arms, but Josiah taught her to balance the load against her hip. "Small loads, more trips," he advised practically. No shame in that. His consideration touched something deep in her heart, though she dared not examine the feeling too closely. Saturday arrived with the promise of town, and they set out in the wagon just after sunrise. Mara sat straight-backed beside Josiah, conscious of the eyes that followed their progress down the dusty main street. Whispers floated like autumn leaves in their wake. That English widow and the Amish farmer. Strange match, if you ask me. Mara lifted her chin, refusing to show how the words stung. They had come for supplies, flour, sugar, coffee, and seeds for the kitchen garden she hoped to start. While Josiah arranged for feed at the livery, Mara headed to the mercantile. She was examining calico when a shadow fell across the fabric. Thomas Keene, the railroad agent, stood beside her, his suit dark and fine against the store's rough-hewn walls. His smile seemed genuine enough, but something in his eyes made her uneasy. "Mrs. Stoltzfus," he said softly, glancing around to ensure their privacy. "A moment of your time?" From his vest pocket, he produced an envelope. $500. "Yours to keep, if you can convince your husband to sell." The paper crackled as he held it out. "Think of what you could do with such money. A new life, perhaps, in a more civilized place." The temptation pulled at her like a physical force. $500, more money than she'd seen since Thomas died. It could buy security, respect, a fresh start somewhere the whispers couldn't follow. But then she thought of Josiah's hands, gentle with the mule, his patience as she learned, the quiet strength that asked nothing of her but honesty. This land was his father's dream, and now it was his. And hers. "No," she said firmly, stepping back. "I won't help you take what isn't. Yours to have." That evening, as they sat down to their simple supper, Mara's conscience wouldn't let her keep silent. "The railroad agent approached me today," she said, watching Josiah's face carefully. "He offered me money to convince you to sell." Josiah's features hardened, his jaw tightening as he set down his fork. But when he spoke, his voice held no anger toward her. "What did you tell him?" "I refused," Mara said simply. "This is your land, our land now. I won't betray that." Something shifted in Josiah's expression then, like sunlight breaking through clouds. A small smile, the first she'd seen, touched his lips. "Thank you," he said quietly, "for telling me. And for—" he gestured vaguely, encompassing everything she hadn't said. Mara found herself returning that smile, surprising herself with how natural it felt. The lamplight flickered between them, casting warm shadows on the walls of their home. In that moment, she felt something delicate and new taking root, a trust as fragile as a spring seedling, but just as full of promise. The Sunday morning sun painted the prairie grass golden as Josiah's wagon rolled toward the simple, white meeting house. Mara smoothed her plain dress, conscious of how different it looked from the dark clothes the Amish women wore. The wheels creaked over the rutted path, and dust settled on her hem. "It won't be like your Methodist services," Josiah said quietly, his first words since they'd set out. The morning light caught the silver threading through his dark beard. Meeting House stood stark against the blue sky, its weathered boards testifying to years of faithful gathering. No steeple reached heavenward, no colored glass adorned the windows. Just clean lines and honest purpose, like Josiah himself. Inside, wooden benches lined the room in tight rows. Men sat on one side, women on the other. Mara found herself guided to a spot among the women, their curious glances warm rather than judgmental. The silence felt thick, reverent, broken only by the rustle of dresses and the scrape of boots on wooden floors. When the singing began, Mara's breath caught. No organ accompanied the German hymns, no piano led the melody. Just pure human voices rising in harmony, ancient tunes passed down through generations. Though she couldn't understand the words, the devotion in them touched her heart. She thought of her childhood church, with its polished choir and printed hymnals, and found herself moved by this raw expression of praise. After the 3-hour service, the community lingered, sharing news and fellowship. Several women approached Mara, their faces kind beneath white prayer caps. "Welcome to our gathering," said one, introducing herself as Sarah Yoder. She pressed a warm loaf of bread into Mara's hands. "Fresh baked this morning," another woman, Rebecca Miller, brought forward a carefully folded quilt. "For your home," she said simply. Every new wife should have one. The pattern spoke of hours of patient stitching, blues and browns woven into stars and squares. Questions followed, gentle but direct. How had she met Josiah? What brought her to their town? Mara answered honestly about the desperate circumstances that led to their hasty marriage. Instead of judgment, she found understanding in their eyes. "The Lord works in mysterious ways," Sarah said, patting Mara's hand. "Sometimes the strangest paths lead to his purpose." The afternoon sun slanted through the kitchen windows as Josiah opened the family Bible. Its leather cover was worn smooth by years of handling, the pages marked with pressed flowers and handwritten notes. Mara sat across from him, fingers busy with mending while he read in his steady voice. "Love is patient, love is kind," he read from 1 Corinthians. "It does not envy, it does not boast, it is not proud." The familiar words took on new meaning in their quiet kitchen. As the light faded, Mara's needle slowed. The question that had haunted her all week finally found voice. "Did you marry me only because you needed a wife by sunset?" Her voice trembled slightly. "Just convenience?" Josiah set the Bible down carefully, considering his words. "I acted in desperation," he admitted. "The land, it was my father's dream, his life's work. I couldn't bear to lose it." He paused, looking at her directly. "But I believe God may yet use it for good." His honesty, though it stung, carried hope in its edges. Mara nodded, understanding growing between them like a tender shoot. Later, as evening settled over the farm, Josiah led her to the barn. The air smelled of hay and leather, earthy and clean. In his palm, he held wheat seeds, showing her how they would plant them come spring. "See how the seed has a groove?" His work-roughened finger traced the line. "That's how you know which way to plant it." Mara reached out to touch the seeds, and their hands brushed. The contact was brief but electric. Neither pulled away immediately, and the silence between them felt different, warm, full of possibility rather than awkwardness. She studied the seed in her palm, thinking how faith was like that, a small thing that could grow into something strong and sustaining. Perhaps their marriage, born of necessity, could also grow into something meaningful. The evening gathered around them as they stood in the barn doorway, watching the sun sink behind the distant hills. The day's revelation settled in Mara's heart, the beauty of simple worship, the kindness of strangers becoming friends, and most of all, the glimpse of Josiah's steady faith that saw God's hand even in their unusual circumstances. Spring sunlight stretched across the farmyard as Mara carried the milk pail to the barn. Her arms had grown stronger over the past weeks, no longer trembling from the weight of daily chores. The cow, a gentle brown creature, greeted her with a soft moo. "There now, Betty," Mara murmured, settling onto the milking stool. Her fingers worked with growing confidence, finding the rhythm that Josiah had taught her. The warm milk hissed against the tin pail, a sound that had become oddly comforting. Later that morning, she churned butter in the kitchen, her shoulders working steadily. Sweat dampened her collar, but satisfaction filled her chest when golden butter finally formed. Outside, she heard the steady thunk of Josiah's axe as he split logs for the cookstove. The days had fallen into a pattern, gathering eggs at dawn, feeding chickens, helping Josiah with whatever the season demanded. He proved a patient teacher, showing her how to grip the axe handle just so, how to stack kindling to catch quickly. His instructions came quietly, firmly, wrapped in practical wisdom. One evening, as the sun painted the sky in shades of amber, they walked the fence line together. The spring air carried the scent of wild roses and fresh grass. Josiah paused near a small marker beneath an old oak tree, his shoulders tense with unspoken grief. Mara's heart tightened when she read the simple inscription, "Sarah Miller, beloved, gone to glory." Fresh flowers lay at its base, Josiah's doing. "She knew. She was my betrothed," he said finally, his voice rough with emotion. 2 winters passed. Fever took her. 3 days between first cough and last breath. His hands gripped the fence post, knuckles white. I'd known her since childhood. We grew up speaking of the farm we'd share, the family we'd raise. Mara stood silent, letting him find his words. Wind rustled through the oak leaves above them. The fever broke something in me, Josiah continued. I told myself I'd never risk loving again. Better to be alone than face such loss. He looked out over the rolling farmland, his face carved with shadows. When father's will demanded marriage by sunset that day, I thought to make it purely practical, a business arrangement. Mara's throat felt tight with compassion. She understood now why he'd seemed so distant those first days, why his kindness came wrapped in reserve. Grief changes us, she said softly. After my Thomas died, I thought my heart would never heal. Josiah turned to look at her, really look at her, perhaps for the first time. Understanding passed between them, two souls. Who knew the weight of widow's weeds and empty chairs at supper? They walked back to the house as evening settled over the land. The kitchen glowed warm through windows that Mara had scrubbed to sparkle. Inside, she took up her mending basket while Josiah lit the lamp and opened his Bible. His coat lay across her lap, needle flashing as she reinforced a worn seam, Josiah's. Voice filled the room with familiar words about new beginnings. Behold, I make all things new. The lamplight caught the silver threading through his beard, the quiet strength in his profile. Through the week, Mara found herself watching him with new eyes, noting his gentle way with the animals, his reverence during evening prayers, how his hands moved sure and steady at every task. The land itself seemed to respond to his care. Spring wheat pushing green shoots through dark soil. Even the railroad's threats felt less daunting. This place, contested though it was, had begun to feel like home. Each morning brought new skills to master, new reasons to be grateful. She learned to read the weather in the sky, to know which chickens laid first, to gauge the day's work by the sun's arc. One evening, as she kneaded bread dough with growing confidence, Mara paused to watch sunset paint the kitchen walls gold. The smell of yeast and fresh-cut hay drifted through open windows. Josiah's quiet footsteps crossed the porch, returning from evening chores. She felt it then, a certainty settling in her heart. This was God's providence, leading her to this farm, this life, this quiet man with his grief-scarred heart. The path ahead might not be easy, with the railroad pressing and tongue still wagging in town, but she was where she belonged. The dough beneath her hands felt warm and alive with possibility, like the future stretching before them. Through the window, she could see the oak tree where Sarah rested, its branches reaching toward heaven. There was room here for both honor, for what was lost, and hope for what might yet grow. Autumn painted the hills in amber and russet as dawn broke over the farmland. Crisp morning air carried the scent of ripened apples and wood smoke when Mara stepped onto the porch, wrapping her shawl tighter against the chill. Josiah already stood by the barn, hitching the plow horse with practiced hands. Time to plant the winter wheat, he called softly. His breath formed small clouds in the cool air. The ground's just right after yesterday's rain. Mara nodded, gathering her skirts as she made her way to the seed barn. Inside, burlap sacks of wheat seed waited, each one carefully stored through summer. She hefted one bag onto her shoulder, proud that the weight no longer made her stagger as it had in spring. They worked their way across the field together, Josiah guiding the plow through dark earth while Mara followed, scattering seed with a practiced swing. The rhythm felt as natural as breathing now, his steady pace breaking soil, her careful sowing ensuring next year's bread. Around mid-morning, a group of town children passed along the road. Their high voices carried clearly across the furrows. "Look there! The English farmwife thinks she's Amish now." One boy called out, pointing. Giggles rippled through the group. 6 months ago, such taunts would have brought heat to Mara's cheeks. Now she simply continued her work, letting the seeds flow through her fingers in an even stream. The children soon grew bored and moved on. At midday, they paused to rest beneath an old oak tree. Mara passed Josiah a cloth-wrapped sandwich and a jar of cool well water. His calloused fingers brushed hers as he took them. "I thank you," he said quietly, "for laboring so faithfully these months." His eyes held warmth that made her heart flutter. Not many town-bred women would take to farm work with such spirit. Mara smiled, holding up her hands to show the honest blisters earned from rope and plow handle. "The land teaches patience," she said, "and good work brings its own reward." That evening, they sat at the kitchen table sharing fresh cornbread and the last of summer's preserved peaches. Mara had learned to bake it just the way Josiah liked, crusty on top but soft inside. A comfortable silence filled the warm room, broken only by the peaceful crackle of the cook stove. "Sarah's mother showed me this recipe," Mara said softly, breaking off a piece of bread. "She visited last week, brought me some of her sourdough starter." Josiah's eyes crinkled at the corners, his quiet way of smiling. "She always did make the best bread in the county." The mention of Sarah no longer brought that deep shadow to his face. Time and grace had done their gentle work. The peaceful moment shattered at a sharp knock on the door. Sheriff Harlan stood on the porch, his badge catching lamplight as Josiah opened the door. "Evening, folks," the sheriff said, removing his hat. "Might I trouble you for a cup of coffee?" Mara moved to the stove while Josiah invited him in. She noticed how the lawman's eyes swept the neat kitchen, lingering on the deed papers visible on a shelf. "Fine crop of wheat you'll have come spring," the sheriff remarked, accepting the coffee cup Mara offered. "Shame if anything happened to it before harvest." Josiah's shoulders stiffened, but his voice remained steady. "The Lord provides for his own. The railroad's offering fair price for this land," Harlan continued. "Better take it while you can. Times are changing. Progress is coming whether folks want it or not." "My father worked this soil for 30 years, Josiah replied. "His father before him. Some things matter more than money." The sheriff set down his cup with a sharp click. "Don't be a fool, Stoltzfus. You really think they'll let an Amish farmer and his English wife stand in the way of progress?" He stood, settling his hat back on his head. "Think on it. Offer won't last forever." After the door closed behind him, silence hung heavy in the kitchen. Mara's hands trembled as she gathered the coffee cups. "He's in their pocket, isn't he?" she asked quietly. "The railroads?" Josiah nodded grimly. "Have suspected it since spring. Too eager to see us sell. Too quick to dismiss complaints about their surveyors trespassing." He reached across the table to catch her trembling hands in his. "I won't fault you if you're afraid." Mara lifted her chin, meeting his concerned gaze. "We'll stand together," she said firmly. "This is our home now, our land to protect." His fingers tightened around hers, warm and strong. Outside, wind rustled through the newly planted wheat field, carrying promise of growth to come. Whatever shadows gathered, they would face them side by side. The night air bit cold and sharp when Mara jolted awake, her nose filled with an acrid smell, smoke. Her heart hammered as she rushed to the window, gasping at the orange glow lighting up the yard. Flames licked the side of the barn, dancing wickedly against the black sky. "Josiah!" She cried out, but he was already moving, throwing on his boots as he ran down the stairs. "The barn's caught!" He shouted back, "Get buckets, quick!" Mara grabbed every pail and pot she could find, her hands shaking as she pumped water at the pia. Well, the flames grew higher, consuming the dry wood with frightening speed. Heat blasted her face as she ran toward Josiah, who had started a desperate bucket line between them. "Here," she called, passing him a full bucket. He flung the water at the base of the flames, but it seemed to make no difference. The fire roared, louder, spreading across the roof like a hungry beast. "The mule!" Josiah suddenly turned pale, Daniel still inside. Before Mara could stop him, he charged through the barn door. Her heart nearly stopped as burning timbers crashed down behind him. Smoke billowed out the entrance, thick and black. "Josiah!" she screamed. Seconds stretched like hours until finally, he burst out of the doorway, leading the panicked mule by its halter. They barely cleared the entrance when the roof collapsed. With a thunderous crash, sending sparks shooting skyward, Mara ran to him, helping him stumble away from the inferno. His right arm was badly burned, the sleeve charred away. The mule stamped nervously nearby as they watched helplessly, while half their barn turned to ash. They worked through the night, throwing water on the embers to keep the fire from spreading to the house. By dawn, gray smoke still curled up from the ruins. The air stank of wet ash and burned wood. The sun had barely risen when Sheriff Harlan rode up, his horse's hooves crunching on the frozen ground. He dismounted slowly, taking in the destruction with an expression that might have been regret or satisfaction. "Mighty shame about your barn," he said, walking the perimeter of the burned structure. "Though seeing as there's no witnesses, can't prove it was sabotage." Josiah stood stiffly beside Mara, his burned arm cradled against his chest. "You know well who did this," he said quietly. The sheriff shook his head. "Could have been anything. Lantern tipped over, hay spontaneous combusting. Way I see it, man who can't protect his property isn't fit to hold on to it." He mounted his horse with a meaningful look. "Might want to reconsider that railroad offer while you still can." After he rode away, Josiah slumped against the well, the fight seeming to drain out of him. Mara guided him inside to tend his burns, her throat tight with unshed tears. "Hold still," she whispered, carefully cleaning the angry red skin with cool water. Josiah barely flinched as she applied healing salve and wrapped clean linen around his arm. When she finished, he stayed seated at the kitchen table, staring at nothing. Mara walked out to the ruined barn alone. Only then did she let her tears fall, thinking of how close she had come to losing him. The smell of smoke clung to everything, their clothes, their hair, even the crisp morning air. Half their winter. Hay was destroyed, along with tools and tack they could ill afford to replace. That evening, they ate a simple supper of cornbread and beans in heavy silence. The kitchen felt colder somehow, despite the cooking fire. Josiah barely touched his food. "You might regret ever marrying me," he said finally, his voice rough with exhaustion. "This fight with the railroad, it will only get worse. You deserve better than living in fear." Mara reached across the table and took his uninjured hand. "I do not regret it," she whispered fiercely. "Not for one moment." He squeezed her fingers. Gently, but worry still lined his face. Later that night, Mara lay awake in her bed, listening to every creak and rustle outside. The moon cast sharp shadows through her window, and she imagined shapes moving in the darkness. Sleep felt dangerous now. Knowing their enemies would not stop at burning barns, her thoughts turned to Josiah, sleeping down the hall, his burned arm a testament to how close disaster had come. They had survived this attack, but what would the next bring? The railroad's grip on the town grew stronger each day. Yet as fear gnawed at her, Mara's resolve only hardened. This was their home, their land, and she would not let terror drive them from it. The morning after the fire dawned gray and cold. Mara stood at the kitchen window, watching wagons approach through the morning mist. First came the Amish families, their horses' breath steaming in the chilly air. Then townspeople arrived, some hanging back uncertainly while others strode forward with purpose. Josiah stepped onto the porch to greet them, his burned arm still bandaged. "Much obliged," he said. Softly as men began unloading tools and lumber from their wagons, Mara's heart swelled at the sight of so many helping hands. The Amish men worked with practiced efficiency, their black hats bobbing as they cleared away burned timbers. Women arrived carrying baskets of food and comfort, their plain dresses swishing as they made their way to the kitchen. The Lord provides. Through community, one Amish woman told Mara, helping her set up tables for the workers' meal. Together they laid out fresh bread, stewed chicken, and pies. The kitchen filled with warmth and the scent of good food. Outside, the sound of hammers rang across the homestead. Amish craftsmen raised new support beams with remarkable speed, their movements synchronized by years of barn-raising experience. Some townspeople worked alongside them, passing boards and holding ladders steadied out around midday. Hoofbeats announced unwelcome visitors. Railroad men rode past slowly, Thomas Keene at their head. They watched the rebuilding effort with obvious disdain, smirking and whispering among themselves. Mara's hands clenched as she saw their satisfied expressions, but she held her tongue. "Don't let them steal your peace," Josiah murmured when she brought him water. His quiet strength steadied her, though worry still creased his brow dot as evening approached. The new barn frame stood tall against the setting sun. Workers began packing up their tools, accepting Mara's heartfelt thanks and plates of leftover food. Soon the homestead grew quiet again, leaving husband and wife alone with their thoughts. They sat at the kitchen table, steam rising from cups of chamomile tea. Josiah's face was troubled in the lamplight. "Sheriff Harlan came by while you were cooking," he said heavily. "Says he's filing papers tomorrow, questioning my right to the land. Claims there's irregularities in the deed transfer from my father." Mara set down her cup with a sharp click. "But surely your father's will proves your claim?" "The will that was filed with the county seems different from what I remember," Josiah admitted. "More favorable to my cousin's interests. But I can't prove anything without the original." "There must be a copy somewhere," Mara insisted. "Your father was methodical in his record-keeping, wasn't he?" Josiah nodded slowly. "He kept everything of importance." "But I've searched his papers many times." Mara sat up straighter as memory struck. "The chest," she said. "That old locked chest I saw in the attic when I was cleaning last week. Have you looked inside?" "It's been locked for years," Josiah said. "The key was lost before Father died." "Then we'll open it another way," Mara declared, already rising. "Bring your tools." Minutes later, they knelt before the heavy wooden chest in the dusty attic. Josiah worked carefully with a pry bar while Mara held the lamp. With a crack of splintering wood, the lock gave way. Inside, they found stacks of yellowed papers, old letters, and leather-bound ledgers. Mara's hands trembled as she lifted out documents one by one. Land deeds, tax records, correspondence with lawyers. And there, at the bottom, a thick envelope sealed with wax. "The will," Josiah breathed, breaking the seal. They bent together over the pages, scanning by lamplight. Mara read carefully, her finger tracking each line until she found something startling. "Look here," she said, pointing to a clause near the end. "Should my son Josiah take a lawful wife in good faith before the specified date, said wife shall share equal claim to all lands and properties herein described." "Josiah, do you understand what this means?" His eyes widened. "You have legal standing to defend the land. They can't just pressure me alone anymore. They'd have to prove both our claims invalid. And the marriage deadline in this will is different from the county copy," Mara noted. "This proves the filed version was altered." Josiah stared at her with new hope dawning in his eyes. "You didn't just save my land by marrying me," he said softly. "You might help me keep it too." Mara clutched the precious document, her heart pounding with purpose. What had begun as a marriage of convenience now gave her the power to stand against those who would steal their home. She was no longer just a stranger seeking shelter. She was a wife with the right and resolved to fight for what was theirs. Dawn broke over the Colorado settlement as Mara and Josiah hitched their wagon for the ride into town. The precious will lay safely tucked in Mara's carpet bag, wrapped in clean muslin. Her hands trembled slightly as she climbed onto the wagon seat, but her spine was straight with purpose. "Are you certain about this?" Josiah asked quietly as they rolled down the rutted road. "As certain as I am about our marriage," Mara replied, clutching her bag closer. The morning sun caught the simple gold band on her finger, a reminder of their unconventional union that had grown into something real and worth defending. The courthouse stood austere and imposing at the end of Main Street, its weathered wooden steps creaking under their boots as they climbed. Inside, the clerk's office smelled of dust and old paper. The young clerk looked up nervously as they approached his desk, his eyes darting toward the sheriff's office next door. "We need to record an amendment to the land deed," Mara said firmly, drawing out the will. "This document shows my legal standing as joint holder of the Stoltzfus property." The clerk's hands shook as he took the papers. I'll need to consult with Sheriff Harlan on this matter," he stammered. "You'll do your duty as clerk first," Mara insisted, her voice carrying across the quiet office. "The law requires you to record valid documents, regardless of who might wish otherwise." Several townspeople lingered in the doorway, drawn by the exchange. The clerk swallowed hard, then began carefully copying the will's crucial clause into the heavy deed book. His pen scratched across the page as more curious onlookers gathered. Word spread quickly through town. By early afternoon, a crowd had assembled in the churchyard, their whispers rising like wind through prairie grass. Mara and Josiah stood on the church steps, waiting as Pastor Abernathy opened the doors. "This seems a fitting place to settle matters of truth," the pastor said solemnly, ushering them inside. The gathered townspeople filed into the pews, their Sunday best replaced by work clothes and dust-covered boots. Sheriff Harlan burst through the doors moments later, his face flushed with anger. Behind him skulked Thomas Keene and his railroad men, their fine suits out of place among the humble congregation. "This is absurd," Harlan blustered. "A marriage of convenience can't grant proper claim to." "But it did grant proper claim," Mara interrupted, her voice clear and strong in the church's perfect acoustics. She held up the will, its pages catching the light streaming through stained glass windows. "This land is ours, and by law and God's witness, I share in its keeping." Murmurs rippled through the pews as she read aloud the clause about a lawful wife's equal claim. Pastor Abernathy stepped forward, nodding gravely. "I performed this marriage in good faith," he affirmed. Whatever brought them together, Mara and Josiah Stoltzfus stand now as husband and wife before God and this community. Their union is legal and binding, as is her claim to share in his inheritance. The sheriff's face darkened as he snatched the will from Mara's hands, scanning it frantically. "This can't be," the county copy clearly states. States what you altered it to say?" Mara challenged. "That document bears Josiah's father's seal and signature. Compare it to your tampered version, Sheriff. I wonder what the circuit judge would make of the differences." More whispers filled. The church's understanding dawned. The railroad agents shifted uncomfortably, their schemes unraveling in the light of truth. Thomas Keene tugged at his collar, edging toward the door. "You can't prove," Harlan started, but his protests died as several respected townspeople stood up from their pews. "I knew Josiah's father," the elderly merchant declared. "That's his seal right enough. And his signature matches the contracts in my ledgers." "The timing of the change will never sat right with me," added another citizen. "Seems we've all been too quiet too long about certain matters in this town." The sheriff's bluster deflated as his allies slipped away. The railroad men retreated through the church doors, their footsteps echoing in defeat. Harlan stood alone, abandoned by those who had promised him profit for his corruption. Josiah stepped forward then, taking Mara's hand before the assembled crowd. "I thank the Lord for sending me a wife of such courage," he said softly, but his words carried in the hushed church. "When I offered marriage, I sought only to keep my father's land. I never imagined finding a true partner to help defend it." Mara's fingers tightened around his as she saw tears of gratitude shining in his eyes. The gathered townspeople began to nod in approval, their earlier judgment of the hasty marriage transformed by this display of unity and purpose. Pastor Abernathy raised his hands in blessing over the couple. Let all here witness this land belongs to Josiah and Mara Stoltzfus, bound by law, by love, and by God's providence. The autumn air turned crisp in the days following their victory at the church. Mara noticed the change first in how people greeted them on their weekly trips to town. Where there had once been whispers and sideways glances, now came tentative smiles and respectful nods. Mrs. Henderson from the Mercantile was the first to appear at their door, bearing a fresh apple pie and shamefaced apologies for her earlier gossip. I reckon I misjudged you both something fierce, she admitted, twisting her apron in her hands. The way you stood up to those railroad men, well, it showed real character. More visitors followed. The quilting circle ladies brought a wedding blanket stitched with intricate patterns, making up for the ceremony they had scorned months ago. Farmer Thompson offered use of his hay wagon, while his wife Rebecca delivered fresh-baked bread and preserves. Never thought I would see the day, Josiah mused one morning as they watched Deacon Miller and his sons helping to repair their fire-damaged barn. The men worked steadily, their hammers ringing out across the homestead. These same folks used to cross the street to avoid greeting me. Mara smiled as she wrapped his burned arm with fresh bandages. The wounds were healing well, but still required careful tending. People can surprise you when given the chance, she said softly, just as we surprised each other. The railroad men had departed town abruptly, their grand plans for a depot crumbling. In the face of united community opposition, Sheriff Harlan kept to his office these days, his authority diminished by the exposure of his corruption. Thomas Keene's empty threats had proven as insubstantial as morning mist under the sun of truth. With Josiah still recovering, more of the daily farm work fell to Mara. She rose before dawn to milk the cow, feed chickens, and tend to the fall. Planting, her hands grew calloused from the hoe and plow, but she felt a deep satisfaction in each task mastered. You handle that team better than most men born to farming, Josiah observed one evening as she brought the horses in from the field. His praise, though quiet, warmed her heart. They fell into a habit of sitting together on the porch after supper, watching the sun paint the sky in brilliant oranges and pinks before settling into darkness. The evening air carried the scent of ripening apples from their small orchard and the distant song of whip-poor wills. I never thought to find peace here, Mara admitted one such evening, her mending forgotten in her lap as she gazed at the stars appearing one by one. When I stepped off that stagecoach, I was so lost, so afraid. Josiah's hand found hers in the gathering dusk. I was afraid too, he confessed. After Sarah died, I thought my heart had died with her. The land was all I had left to fight for. And now, Mara asked softly, now I see God's hand in it all. Josiah's voice grew thick with emotion. I thought I married you in desperation, seeking only to keep my father's legacy, but the Lord had a greater purpose. Mara squeezed his hand gently, remembering their hasty wedding, the struggles that followed, and the strength they had found. Together, we have both been blessed with second chances. More than that, Josiah said. I know now that you are not just my wife by law or necessity. You are God's provision for me, a true helpmate, a woman of valor. His words, though simple, carried the weight of deep conviction. The moon rose full and bright over their land as they sat in companionable silence. Finally, Josiah spoke again. Would you pray with me? We have faced much together, but never properly brought our marriage before the Lord. Mara's heart swelled as they knelt together on the rough porch boards. Josiah's prayer was plain but profound, thanking God for his providence in bringing them together and asking blessing on their union. Mara added her own words of gratitude, her voice trembling with emotion. The crickets sang their evening chorus as husband and wife rose from their prayers, their hands still clasped. Something had shifted between them, deeper than legal claims or community acceptance. In acknowledging their marriage as God's gift rather than mere convenience, they had finally become truly wed in heart as well as law. The first frost came early. That year, painting the farmhouse windows with delicate patterns and bringing bitter winds that whistled through every crack. Mara rose before dawn each morning to stoke the kitchen fire, watching her breath mist in the cold air until warmth slowly filled the room. She had learned to keep the house cozy despite winter's grip. Her needle flew through worn quilts, patching holes and adding layers of warmth. The scent of hearty stews simmering on the stove filled their home, made from root vegetables they had stored in the root cellar and dried herbs hanging from the rafters. "Best beef and barley stew I've tasted," Josiah said one evening, snow melting from his coat as he stamped his boots by the door. He had spent the day mending fences, his fingers red and raw from working in the bitter cold. Mara ladled another, helping into his bowl. "The secret's in letting it simmer all day," she replied, pleased by his praise. She had come to take pride in these simple domestic victories, so different from her former life in town. When word spread that the Miller family had fallen ill with winter fever, Mara didn't hesitate. She packed a basket with fresh bread, dried apple slices, and jars of her soup. The path to their homestead was icy, but she made the journey carefully, remembering her own desperate times. "The Lord bless you," Mrs. Miller whispered weakly when Mara delivered the food. Similar scenes played out across their small community as winter tightened its grip. Mara became known for her quiet acts of kindness, her baskets appearing on doorsteps where need was greatest. "Folks say you're an angel of mercy," Josiah told her one evening as she wrapped potatoes in cloth to keep them warm for another delivery. "Far cry from how they viewed you when you first arrived." Mara smiled, remembering the suspicious glances and whispered judgments. "The Lord works in mysterious ways," she said softly. "Sometimes it takes desperate times to reveal his purpose." The afternoon was growing dim when the letter arrived. Mara recognized the railroad's official letterhead immediately, her heart quickening as she broke the seal. Josiah came in from the barn, stamping snow from his boots, and found her standing, motionless by the fire. "What is it?" he asked, concern creasing his brow. "A letter from the railroad," Mara said, her voice steady despite her racing pulse. She held the paper closer to the lamplight and began to read aloud. "To Mr. and Mrs. Josiah Stoltzfus, regarding the matter of land acquisition, the railroad company hereby withdraws all claims and interest in your property. Previous offers are null and void. We wish you well in your continued stewardship of the land." Relief flooded through her as the words sank in. The threat that had haunted them since summer was finally lifted. Josiah stood silent for a long moment, then slowly removed his hat. "Praise be to God," he said quietly. Mara set the letter aside and went to the kitchen, returning with 2 cups of hot cider. They sat together by the crackling fire, letting the warmth of victory and spiced drink chase away the winter chill. "Do you remember that day?" Mara asked after a while, watching the flames dance. "When I first arrived in town?" Josiah nodded, a slight smile touching his lips. "You looked ready to collapse from weariness, but there was steel in your spine even then. And you offered marriage before sunset." Mara chuckled softly. "I thought you were mad." "Perhaps I was," Josiah admitted. "Desperate times make for desperate choices. But God's hand was in it, though I couldn't see it then." Outside, snow began to fall in thick, lazy flakes, adding another layer of white to the sleeping fields. The firelight cast a warm glow across the room, making shadows dance on the walls. Mara watched Josiah's face, noting how the stern lines had softened over the months of their marriage. He turned to meet her gaze, his eyes gentle in the flickering light. "By sunset that day, I asked for a wife," he said softly. Tonight, by God's grace, I have a partner." Mara felt warmth spread through her chest that had nothing to do with the fire or cider. She leaned against his shoulder, feeling the solid strength of him. They had faced so much together: suspicion, sabotage, hardship, and emerged stronger for it. The snow continued to fall outside their window, but inside, the farmhouse was warm with more than just fire. It was warm with the heat of genuine love, hard-won trust, and the knowledge that their marriage, though begun in haste, had grown into something true and lasting. The morning of the community gathering dawned crisp and clear. Mara stood in her kitchen, flour dusting her apron as she kneaded dough beside Sarah Yoder and Rachel Miller. The neighbor women had arrived early to teach her their traditional bread recipes, passed down through generations. "Fold it gentle-like," Sarah instructed, demonstrating with weathered hands. "The secret's in letting it rise twice." Mara watched carefully, determined to master the technique. The kitchen filled with warmth and the yeasty smell of rising bread as the women worked and taught. By midday, the restored barn stood proud against the winter sky, stronger than before the fire. Neighbors gathered for the celebration, bringing dishes and good cheer. Mara's fresh-baked loaves earned appreciative nods from the Amish women, and she felt a surge of belonging. Josiah stood beside her as Pastor Abernathy blessed the new structure. The crowd had grown, including many townsfolk who had once whispered behind their backs. Now they joined in the hymns that rose clear and strong in the cold air. "Brother Stoltzfus," the pastor called out, "would you share from Scripture?" Josiah stepped forward, Bible in hand. His voice carried across the gathering as he read from Psalms. "Unless the Lord builds the house, they labor in vain who build it." Mara watched him with pride, seeing not just her husband, but a man respected by his community. After the feast and fellowship, as evening drew near, Josiah led Mara back to their farmhouse. "I have something for you," he said, lighting the lamp. In the warm glow, she saw it, a beautifully crafted rocking chair, its wood smooth and gleaming. "You made this?" Mara whispered, running her hand along the curved arm. Josiah nodded. "Been working on it in spare moments. Thought you might like a place to rest and sew." Tears welled in Mara's eyes as she remembered the lonely days after her first husband's death, when she had nothing but grief for company. Now looking around their home, at the quilt she had mended, the bread cooling on the rack, the Bible on the table, her heart felt full to bursting. "This home is full now," she said softly, "full of love." Snow began falling as they walked to check on the animals one last time. Their boots crunched on fresh powder, and the mule greeted them with a friendly snort from his warm stall. Back inside, they settled by the fire, savoring the peace they had fought so hard to win. The rocking chair creaked gently as Mara sat, her needle flashing in the firelight, while Josiah read from his father's old Bible. Around them, their home glowed with warmth, faith, and the blessing of a love that had grown from necessity into something true and lasting. Spring arrived like a gentle awakening, melting winter's grip from the Colorado soil. The morning air held a promising warmth as Mara walked between the rows of emerging wheat. Dawn painted the sky in soft pinks and golds, casting long shadows across the field where she and Josiah had labored together in autumn's chill. Each tender green shoot spoke of hope, pushing through earth they had tilled and sown as one. Mara knelt, touching the delicate leaves with wonder. These weren't just crops. They were proof of their shared dedication, their partnership sealed by both law and love. The crunch of boots on thawing ground made her turn. Josiah approached, wooden egg basket in hand, his face softened by the early light. He paused beside her, gazing across their land they had defended together against the railroad schemes. The fresh breeze carried the scent of damp earth and new growth. "Remember when we planted these?" Mara asked, rising to stand beside him. The memory of those autumn days filled her mind, learning to scatter seed just so, working side by side until sunset, finding strength in each other's company. Josiah nodded, his eyes distant with reflection. He set down the basket and took her hand, his calloused fingers warm against hers. When he spoke, his voice held an unfamiliar tremor. That evening, I thought I gained a wife by law. But what I found was love beyond measure. Mara's heart swelled at his words. Through all the trials, the threats, the barn fire, the whispered doubts, they had grown from strangers into true partners. She squeezed his hand, her own voice rich with emotion. God bound us by sunset, but love sealed us for every sunrise after. As if marking her words, the rooster's crow split the morning air. The sun crested the eastern hills, spilling golden light across their fields. Wheat stalks gleamed like promises kept, like prayers answered in God's own time. Hand in hand, they turned toward home. The farmhouse stood warm and welcoming in the growing light, a beacon of the life they had built together. Their footsteps fell in easy rhythm as they walked, matching the steady beat of their hearts, sure in the knowledge that what had begun as necessity had blossomed into love's sweetest harvest. Thank you for being here. If something in this story stayed with you, I'd love to see you again. Subscribe, and tomorrow I'll bring you another story crafted with heart.